Hey everyone, let's talk about scope. This is a little bit more of an abstract issue that's nonetheless important in your coding, and you're going to be thinking about it and dealing with it a lot more throughout the rest of the semester. But I would say this is the first issue that is not really a basic type of issue where you're just learning to code the very basics, things like loops, if statements, conditions, functions. This is a little bit more abstract, um, but it's kind of cool actually. So let's talk about what this is. So the scope of a variable is the set of all the places in the program where that variable can actually be used, where it can be referenced. So when you define a variable, who can use it? Where can you actually use it? Okay. So the thing is that not all the variables are actually visible everywhere. And that's a good thing because it makes it much less likely that functions are going to mess with each other. Because let's say you've got two functions that both need to rely on some variable. Well, if one function changes that variable, then the other one might be messed up because of that. Okay. So one example in the real workplace is that if people are working together on things, then they can write one function, and another function. One person can write function one, the other person can write function two. If their functions don't mess with the variables that are outside of those functions, then these two people who are working together aren't going to mess each other up. If the functions do change something outside, then that could potentially be detrimental, because it's like person A is writing function one, which is going to be run first. Person B is writing function two. Well, person B is expecting this variable to be, I don't know, a 5-character long string. And person A is going to make it actually output something that's 25 characters long. Like, that's not good. So issues like that can be avoided by the fact that variables can actually have a proper scope. And we'll talk about how to do that and what that all means. This also allows functions to be written in parallel. So for example, two functions can call a variable that's called count. And they can both count something, and they don't need to worry about the variable messing with itself. They don't have to worry about the variable being two different values or something. What does it mean to write code in parallel? It means that, well, you have more than one process running at the same exact time. And so like your CPU might have actually like 4, 8 or more processors in it, and they might actually all be doing tasks simultaneously. And so, for example, as you're moving your mouse and typing, those are two different processes. This is a kind of really trivial example, but this as a type of situation where you might want two different processors to handle that. So if you're doing things simultaneously, you can have multiple processors handling that. More importantly, like if you need to do some big calculation, and it can be split up in so that 8 different processors can be working on different parts of the calculation, then that'll make it run 8 times faster. Right? So that's a good thing. So if you want the value of a variable to be available to another function, then you need to pass it as a parameter. So functions shouldn't be changing a variable that is kind of global, meaning that it's being used by the whole program. The function should get this variable as a parameter so that it deals with it in its own little housing unit, so it doesn't mess with the rest of the program. And if you want another function to change your variable, then you need to use the return value. So what you need to do is you need to write a function, have it return something, and outside of the function, set the variable equal to the return value. So here's an example. If you have a username, right, and the user enters a username, so one thing you might want to do is check the length of the username. Maybe you want the username to be exactly 8 letters long, right? And so if the user enters something longer, then you want to warn the user or something. I don't know. You might want to check that the username doesn't have any numbers in it. So depending on what you're using the username for, you might want there to be no numbers or no, I don't know, pounds or other characters like ampersands or something. You probably don't want to mess with the username itself as you check the length. So if your check length function somehow can shorten the username to 8 characters, that's not good. Right? So we don't want these functions to actually change username. Well, turns out that Python actually handles that automatically. Username is a string because it's gotten via the input function. And it turns out Python functions don't actually change a string if it's passed as a parameter. And we'll see that in code. So here's an example where you have a cups to gallons function that takes a variable called num cups and divides it by 16. So that's the number of gallons. Notice outside of the function, we're defining the number of cups via a different variable than num cups. We're going to pass that variable cups to the function. And here's an example of where if you want to change the number of gallons, then you do it by having the function return the number of gallons, and you set the gallons equal to what the function returned. Okay, so if you want to change the number of gallons, you don't have this function change it. You have the function return the number of gallons, and then you manually change it via setting gallons equal to what that returned. The other thing is, so this variable is looks different from this variable. It doesn't have to be. There's no reason that it should be for Python to actually work, for this code to actually work. But in terms of clarity, it does help, because here, if we have 2 different variables, then we can sort of keep in mind that cups is on the outside of the function. That's what we're working with outside the function. And num cups is on the inside. So it's just good naming convention to label a variable that's inside the function as something different than something that's outside the function. But you don't actually have to. Okay, now I want to take a look at some code with you. So a function works with its own variables. It doesn't change variables outside of itself unless they're passed to the function. So what does that mean? So if you have a variable called x, let's say defined outside of this function, if you have any function, it's not actually going to change the value of that x. It's only going to work with its own variables. And so even if you have a variable called x inside the function, okay, get this x is different from this x. That's crazy, right? This x is different from this x. The way that Python manages the code internally is it's saying, okay, we've got a function here. Any variable that's defined in here is going to be stored in a different location than something that's outside the function. So if we call this function and then print out x, can you guess what it should be? Is it going to be 5, or did the function change it to 3? Okay, hopefully you guessed right. It didn't change it because it's a different variable that's set to 3. You can even print it out. Hey, x is, and you can print out x. If you call that, the function thinks x is 3. But outside the function, x is a totally different variable and still 5. What if I have a function and I set the variable a equal to 5, and I try to print out a outside the function? There's only one variable a, right? So shouldn't it get the a from inside the function? There's no other a. Well, let's see what happens. Error. It says name a is not defined. And you might be thinking, how is it not defined? A is defined to be 5. Well, remember, a is defined to be 5 only inside that function. Oh, but wait a minute, I didn't even call this function. What if I call this function? Will that change it? No. Even though I've called the function, even though this function has been called and it has set a equal to 5, it still doesn't know what a is outside the function. We can even make sure that the function actually ran. Yes, I'm running. I'm going to make the function print out, yes, I'm running, just to make sure that we have actually executed this code. And yes, it was running. It has set a equal to 5, and yet Python is still saying a is not defined, because a is defined inside the function, not outside the function. This is outside the function because it's tabbed. It's not tabbed over like the rest of that function code. Okay. A function doesn't actually change many variables if you pass them in as arguments. So if you really need a function to change a variable, it's not going to be that easy. You should really use the return value to set a variable equal to something. So for example, it doesn't change any of the standard immutable variables of Python. The immutable variables, well, we don't know that many variable types. So let me just tell you some that we do know. We know an integer, we know a string, so that's a list of characters. We know a Boolean. We haven't talked about tuples yet, but tuples are also immutable. And so if you pass any of these as arguments into a function and have the function try to change them, it actually won't change them outside of the function. All right, so here we've got this function which takes in x as a parameter. So now it's a parameter, right? It's not just a function that is using x as an individual entity. We've actually got x passed in as a parameter. The function changes x to 3. So what we're going to do is set x to 5, run the function on x. We're passing this variable into the function. So the function should be thinking about it like, hey, this is the variable that we got from the outside. We're going to change this to 3. And just so you are sure that it worked, this function worked. It's going to print out, yes, it worked. Let's see what happens when we run this function and supposedly change x to 3. Let's see what x will be in the end. It's still 5. Okay, so a function doesn't actually change an integer, even if it's passed as a parameter. Right? It certainly won't change it if it's not even passed as a parameter. This is clearly a different variable inside the function. But even if the variable is passed as a parameter, it's still thinking of it as something else. It's just getting the value of x, and it can use that value. So if you set the variable equal to something, it's not going to be changed outside. Okay. Similarly, it won't change a string. So if you start with a string called s, which is set to start, and then you run the function, pass the string s into the function. Here we go, like this, and change s to changed. So you can print out the new s is, and we'll print out s inside the function, and then we'll print out s here. Outside s is still start. Okay, so the function had s set to changed. It did change because it says new s is changed. But outside of the function, after we run it, it still hasn't changed. It's still the starting string. One last thing, a function does change a list. So that's the only variable type that we know that is actually changed if you pass it in as an argument. So be aware that if you're working with a list, if you're having a function work with a list, you can actually modify what that list is. And that could cause problems for the outside. So just make sure that when you do that, then you're really careful if you're actually modifying something. So here we have my list set to 1, 2, 3. It doesn't really matter if I write it before the function or after the function. I could put it here, or I could put it here. It just matters that I have this definition and I have my list defined before I call the function. Now I've got this list, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to pass it into the function. And what the function does is it takes this list as an argument, changes its first value to 4, right? The index 0 value is the first one. It's going to change that to 4. And so let's see what happens. Does it actually change or not? It does change. So a function will change a list, but it will not change any other variable. What if you want a function to change something? Like what if you wanted this string to become the changed string? Well, the way to handle that is you say return s, and then you would change it in the place where you're actually calling the function. Right? You change it outside the function. You say s equals the return value of the function. And now it'll work. Okay, so this is how you set a string. You don't have a function change it. You have the string change it. You change it outside the function. You set the string equal to the return value. One more thing, just real quick to note about strings is that if you have a string like s equals start, you can't actually modify index of a string. Like you can't change the first letter of the string to be, I don't know, a. Capital S here. So it says str object does not support item assignment. So that means that the object str, which is the general object that's responsible for handling strings, does not support some kind of functionality. The functionality that it doesn't support is item assignment. You can't assign something to an item of it. So you can't assign it the first letter. You can't change the first letter. A string is different from a list. A string is very different from a list. In a list, you can actually do that. So if you have a my list and you have, let's say, a list of letters like this, then you actually can change the first letter. If 0 equals, let's say, when I make that a. Then that actually does work. So this is because a string is very different from a list. You can modify a list or parts of it. It's not an immutable variable. You cannot modify a string. It's an immutable variable. And so if you wanted the string to start with an a, then what you'd have to do is you'd have to go like this. Instead of changing s sub 0 equal to a, what you would have to do is you could, well, for example, you could say s is going to now be a plus, and we're going to get the rest of it. And you can splice a string just like you splice a list. That'll get you a subset of the string, a substring. And so this is going to be a followed by tart. And then you can change that. So we're going to set s to be that new string. So this is going to be a completely new string that Python makes, and we're going to set s to that. So that works. Okay. Yeah, so you can still splice strings. You just can't change one little item of a string, one character of a string. You can only do that with lists. Lots of stuff learned here. For everything that you learned, write down something, take notes, and try it out with programming. Okay, if you don't try it out, you're going to forget it. So just try it out right now. Maybe go back over the video and make sure you're understanding all that. Thanks for watching. Take care.